Disclaimer. In 1939, Britain did not merely participate in global power, it embodied it. A quarter of the Earth's landmass answered to London. A quarter of the world's population lived under British rule. British ships controlled the sea lanes that moved global trade. British banks financed the world's infrastructure. British legal standards governed international contracts. And above all else, the pound sterling was the money the world trusted. Britain was not simply influential, it was unavoidable. If a nation wanted to trade internationally, it needed pounds. If a company wanted long-term capital, it went to London. If shipping lanes needed protection, the Royal Navy provided it. Britain did not just sit at the table of global power. It owned the table, wrote the rules, and enforced them. And yet, within a single generation, that dominance collapsed. Less than 20 years later, Britain would be forced to ask the United States for permission to protect its own strategic interests. Its currency would be repeatedly devalued. Its industries would hollow out. And eventually, the nation that once ruled the world would be begging the International Monetary Fund for emergency assistance. The empire that shaped the modern world for 200 years fell in roughly 30. Most people are taught a comforting version of this story. A story of moral awakening, of enlightened leaders voluntarily dismantling empire, of progress replacing domination. And while those explanations contain fragments of truth, they avoid the central reality. Britain did not abandon its empire because it wanted to. Britain lost its empire because it could no longer afford it. Empires do not collapse because of ideas. They collapse because of arithmetic. Britain won World War II militarily, but economically, it lost the war that actually mattered. And in losing it, global power quietly crossed the Atlantic, not with explosions or speeches, but with debt contracts, currency arrangements, and financial leverage. To understand how this happened, we must return to the moment Britain looked strongest. After World War I, Britain appeared unshakable. By 1920, its empire stretched across nearly 14 million square miles and governed more than 450 million people. Its territories spanned Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, and the Pacific. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was not poetic exaggeration, it was geographical fact. But land was never Britain's true source of power. Money was. The pound sterling functioned as the world's reserve currency. Global trade contracts were written in pounds. Central banks held sterling as a store of value. International loans were denominated in British currency. The City of London was the central nervous system of global finance. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. British investors owned railroads in South America, mines in Africa, plantations in Asia, shipping companies across the Pacific, and industrial enterprises on every continent. Capital flowed outward from London, binding the world's economy to Britain's financial system. This dominance granted Britain a unique privilege. It could borrow money more cheaply than any other nation. That meant it could sustain a massive navy, administer distant colonies, and project power globally without immediate financial strain. Everything depended on trust. The pound was backed by gold, not symbolically, but physically. Anyone holding British currency could exchange paper for metal at a fixed rate. That promise created confidence. Confidence created stability. Stability created dominance. The United States had already surpassed Britain in raw industrial output, but Britain still controlled the system itself. And controlling the system matters more than size. But beneath the surface, the foundations were weakening. The first great rupture came with World War I. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain financed one of the most expensive conflicts in human history. The cost dwarfed the size of its entire pre-war economy. To survive, Britain raised taxes to unprecedented levels, issued enormous quantities of government debt, and sold off overseas investments that had taken generations to accumulate. For the first time in modern history, Britain became a debtor nation, and its largest creditor was the United States. Gold reserves drained away, foreign assets were liquidated, British ownership of global infrastructure shrank dramatically. Even worse, Britain abandoned the gold standard so it could print money to fund the war. The pound, once as good as gold, became just paper backed by promises. When the war ended, Britain tried to restore the old order. In 1925, it returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. It was an act of denial, not strength. The pound was now massively overvalued. British exports became expensive and uncompetitive. Deflation gripped the economy. Unemployment surged. Entire industrial regions fell into permanent decline. Britain still looked like a global power, but financially it was already wounded. The balance of global power had shifted, quietly, invisibly, but permanently. Then came World War II. If the first war cracked the empire, the second shattered it. Britain fought through total mobilization. At the height of the conflict, more than half of the nation's entire economic output was devoted to survival. Food was rationed. Fuel was rationed. Clothing was rationed. Industry existed solely to feed the war machine. Every remaining asset was sacrificed. By the early 1940s, Britain was functionally bankrupt. That was when the United States intervened with the Lend-Lease program, supplying weapons, fuel, food, and industrial materials. But this was not charity. The aid came with interest, and it came with conditions. Britain was forced to dismantle imperial trade preferences, open its empire to American corporations, and accept U.S. financial oversight. In exchange for survival, Britain surrendered economic sovereignty. By the end of the war, Britain's national debt exceeded twice the size of its entire economy. In just 3 decades, Britain had gone from the world's greatest creditor to one of its most indebted nations. The empire still existed on paper, but economically, it was finished. And as the war drew to a close, the question was no longer whether Britain would lose global dominance, but who would replace it. As the Second World War came to an end, global leaders gathered to design the post-war financial order. Britain arrived with history, prestige, and experience, but it also arrived bankrupt. British economists proposed a neutral international currency, a system where no single nation would dominate global trade. It was an attempt to preserve balance, to prevent the mistakes of the past from repeating. The United States rejected it. America insisted that the dollar become the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed price. And this time, Britain had no leverage to resist. The war had drained its gold, sold its assets, and left it dependent on American credit. This decision quietly reshaped the modern world. Reserve currency status is not symbolic. It creates constant global demand for your money. It allows you to run trade deficits without immediate consequences. It lets you borrow at the lowest interest rates. And it turns your financial system into the center of global power. For 2 centuries, Britain had enjoyed these privileges. Now they belong to the United States. Overnight, the pound became vulnerable. Britain tried desperately to maintain the illusion of greatness, but the mathematics no longer worked. Maintaining an empire required military bases across the globe, naval patrols in every ocean, colonial administrations, infrastructure investments, and constant suppression of independence movements. Britain's economy was far smaller than America, dar SS, yet it was trying to sustain a global footprint the numbers could no longer justify. The illusion finally collapsed in 1956. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain launched a military operation to reclaim it. Militarily, Britain succeeded. But financially, it failed almost instantly. The United States threatened to sell its pound reserves, block emergency loans, and cut off vital oil supplies. The British currency began to collapse in real time. Faced with financial annihilation, Britain withdrew in humiliation. The message was unmistakable. British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. From that moment forward, decline accelerated. The pound was repeatedly devalued. Trade deficits became permanent. Inflation rose, growth stagnated, industry collapsed. Talent fled abroad. By the 1970s, Britain, once the richest nation on earth, was forced to beg the International Monetary Fund for emergency assistance. The empire was liquidated not because Britain wanted to leave, but because it could no longer pay the bills. Britain's collapse followed a clear pattern. Massive war debt, loss of reserve currency status, persistent trade deficits, repeated currency devaluation, dependence on foreign creditors, loss of political independence, and forced liquidation of assets. Now look at the United States. Exploding debt exceeding $35 trillion, endless military commitments, permanent trade deficits, rising interest costs, a slow but visible erosion of dollar dominance. The parallels are impossible to ignore. The most unsettling difference is speed. What took Britain 30 years could unfold far faster in today's hyper-connected financial system. Empires do not fall because of moral progress. They fall because they go broke. Financial power is the only real power. Military strength is meaningless if you cannot afford it, and reserve currency status is the ultimate superweapon. Britain learned this lesson the hard way. America may be learning it next, and history is unforgiving to those who believe they are exempt from its rules. If this changed how you see history, subscribe for more deep dives into the economic forces that actually shape the world. And let me know in the comments, how close do you think America is to its own Suez moment?